With his whip raised high above the trembling, collapsed horse, Alexander Harrington's world shattered when a child's brave voice cut through the crowd. "If you want to hit it, you'll have to hit me first." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The cobblestone streets of London's financial district glistened under the morning drizzle, reflecting the muted gray of the sky above. Among the sea of black umbrellas and hurried footsteps walked Alexander Harrington III, his polished leather shoes clicking against the wet stone with purpose and authority. At 47, Alexander had built an empire that stretched across continents. His investment firm handled billions. His name carried weight in boardrooms from New York to Singapore, and his mere presence commanded respect, or at the very least, fear. This particular morning, Alexander's face was set in its usual stern expression, his sharp features hardened by years of cutthroat business dealings. His tailored charcoal suit remained impeccably crisp despite the damp weather, protected by the large black umbrella held perfectly centered above his head. At his side walked his personal assistant, struggling to keep pace while balancing a leather portfolio, a coffee, and her own smaller umbrella. "The Wellington account paperwork needs your signature by noon, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "And don't forget the charity gala tonight at 7. Your speech has been prepared, reviewed, and memorized." Alexander cut her off without breaking stride. "Anything else?" The assistant swallowed hard. "Your son called again this morning. He was hoping you might attend his school play next. Schedule a call with him for tomorrow evening. I'll explain my absence then." Alexander's tone left no room for discussion. Family obligations were simply another appointment to be managed, another task to be delegated or rescheduled when more important matters demanded his attention. As they approached the intersection where Threadneedle Street met the main thoroughfare, the usual morning traffic had slowed to a complete halt. A crowd had gathered ahead, their murmurs rising above the idle engines and occasional horn. Alexander's jaw tightened with annoyance at the delay. "What is this nonsense?" he muttered, checking his platinum watch. "I have a meeting in 15 minutes. Without waiting for his assistant's response, Alexander pushed forward through the crowd, his commanding presence causing people to step aside almost instinctively. When he reached the front of the gathering, he found the source of the disruption. A horse-drawn cart had stopped in the middle of the intersection, and the horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face, had collapsed onto the cobblestones, her legs splayed awkwardly beneath her. The cart was loaded with vegetables and fruits destined for the local market, and the driver, a thin man with weathered skin and clothes that had seen better days, was desperately trying to get the horse back on her feet. Alexander took in the scene with cold assessment. The horse was clearly underfed, her ribs visible beneath a dull coat, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Get up, Daisy. Please, girl, get up." The driver's voice cracked with desperation as he tugged at the reins. "I can't afford another day without sales." The mare attempted to rise, her legs trembling with the effort, only to collapse again with a pained whimper that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. The sound stirred something uncomfortable in Alexander's chest, a feeling he quickly dismissed as impatience. "This is ridiculous," Alexander said loudly, stepping forward. "Some of us have actual business to conduct." The driver looked up, his face flushing with embarrassment when he recognized the type of man addressing him, wealthy, powerful, and currently inconvenienced. "I'm sorry, sir. She's never done this before. She's a good horse, just clearly not up to the task," Alexander finished for him, his voice cutting like steel. "Your poor planning and neglect is costing everyone valuable time." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement with Alexander, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances, perhaps recognizing the harsh truth in his words but finding his delivery unnecessarily cruel. The driver's shoulders slumped. "I've been trying to feed her better, sir. Times have been hard since my wife fell ill, and I don't recall asking for your life story," Alexander interrupted, removing his leather gloves with deliberate slowness. He handed his umbrella to his assistant and stepped closer to the fallen horse. Sometimes what's needed is a firmer hand. Before anyone could react, Alexander reached down and picked up the driver's whip from where it had fallen on the cobblestones. With practiced precision, a remnant of his equestrian days at boarding school, he flicked the whip in the air, creating a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent street. "Get up," he commanded the horse, bringing the whip down near her hindquarters without actually striking her. It was a warning, a display of dominance. When the mare only trembled in response, Alexander's patience evaporated. He raised the whip higher, his intention clear. "Sometimes you have to show them who's in charge," he said to no one in particular, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. But as the whip began its downward arc, a small figure darted from the crowd and placed himself squarely between Alexander and the fallen horse. A boy, no more than 8 years old, dressed in simple clothes with a worn woolen vest and cap, stood with his arms spread wide in protection of the mare. His small face was set in a determination that seemed too large for his young features, his eyes blazing with a courage that momentarily stunned Alexander into immobility. "Stop it!" the boy shouted, his voice high but unwavering. "Can't you see she's trying? Can't you see she's hurt?" Alexander lowered the whip slightly, caught off guard by the child's intervention. "Step aside, boy. This doesn't concern you." But the child stood his ground, his small chest heaving with emotion. "She's tired and hungry. She needs help, not hitting." The crowd had grown completely silent now, all eyes fixed on the confrontation between the powerful businessman and the small, defiant child. Alexander felt a flicker of embarrassment at being challenged by a mere boy, and his grip on the whip tightened. "I won't tell you again," Alexander said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Move aside." The boy's next words would be remembered by everyone present, words that would echo in Alexander's mind for years to come. Drawing himself up to his full, if diminutive, height, the child looked Alexander straight in the eyes and declared with trembling but resolute voice, "If you want to hit her, you'll have to hit me first." The world seemed to pause. The falling rain, the watching crowd, the distant sounds of the city, all faded into the background as Alexander found himself locked in a silent battle of wills with a child whose name he didn't even know. In the boy's eyes, Alexander saw something he rarely encountered in his world of power and money: pure, uncompromising moral certainty. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Harrington III found himself uncertain of his next move. Alexander stood frozen, the whip suspended in midair, its shadow falling across the boy's determined face. The crowd's collective breath seemed held, the tension stretching like a wire pulled taut. In that moment of suspended animation, Alexander found himself transported back to another time, another place, to a 12-year-old version of himself standing before his father's desk, trembling but defiant, after defending a stable hand who'd been unjustly accused of negligence. "You show weakness, Alexander," his father had said, voice like granite. "The world respects only strength and decisiveness." The memory vanished as quickly as it had surfaced, but it left Alexander disoriented. The boy before him remained unflinching, arms still spread protectively over the fallen horse, his small body a fragile but immovable barrier. Finally, a murmur rippled through the crowd, breaking the spell. Alexander became acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching him, judging him. His assistant shifted uncomfortably behind him. Someone in the back of the crowd had their phone raised, undoubtedly recording the confrontation. In today's world of viral videos and instant social media judgment, this was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. With deliberate slowness, Alexander lowered the whip. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, his voice betraying nothing of his inner turmoil. The child hesitated, clearly surprised by the question, but unwilling to relax his guard. "Oliver," he finally answered. "Oliver Mills." "Well, Oliver Mills," Alexander said, slipping the whip into his coat. "You've made your point, but sentimentality won't get this horse on its feet or clear this intersection." Oliver's chin lifted slightly. "She needs water and rest, not shouting and hitting. My grandpa taught me that animals give you everything they have if you treat them right." Another ripple went through the crowd, this time accompanied by nods of approval and a few murmured agreements. Alexander felt the tide of public opinion shifting against him, an unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable sensation. The cart driver had moved to stand beside Oliver, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "The lad's right, sir. Daisy's given me years of good service. I've just been pushing her too hard lately with my wife's medical bills and all." Alexander's jaw tightened. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, let alone lectured on morality by a child and a struggling cart driver. Every instinct honed over decades in the cutthroat world of finance told him to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone present of exactly who he was. Instead, he found himself looking back at the fallen horse. Daisy's eyes were wide with exhaustion and pain, her breathing labored. There was something in that gaze that unsettled him, a dignity despite her circumstances, a silent endurance that suddenly seemed more worthy of respect than derision. "Mr. Harrington, we should really be going," his assistant ventured cautiously from behind him. "The Wellington meeting—" "Call Davis," Alexander cut her off, not taking his eyes from the horse. "Tell him I'll be delayed. Family emergency." Before his assistant could respond, Alexander removed his expensive suit jacket and handed it to her along with his tie. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the imposing businessman rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt and knelt beside the fallen horse. "Do you have water?" he asked the cart driver, his tone businesslike but no longer hostile. The driver blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. A canteen in the cart." "Get it," Alexander ordered, running expert hands along the horse's neck and flanks. Despite the years since his equestrian days, the knowledge came back easily. "She's dehydrated and exhausted, but I don't feel any broken bones." Oliver still stood protectively near the horse's head, watching Alexander with cautious hope. "Are you going to help her?" "That's what I'm attempting to do," Alexander replied, not looking up as he continued his assessment. "If you want to be useful, boy, stroke her neck and speak softly to her. Horses respond to calm voices." Oliver immediately knelt and began gently stroking Daisy's neck, whispering reassurances. The driver returned with the canteen, and Alexander carefully lifted the horse's head, allowing her to drink small amounts at a time. "Not too much at once," he instructed. "Small sips." As he worked, Alexander became aware of a shift in the atmosphere around him. The impatient mutters of the crowd had transformed into supportive murmurs. Someone from a nearby cafe brought a bucket of clean water. A woman offered sugar cubes from her purse, explaining they might give the horse a small energy boost. Alexander found himself working alongside Oliver and the driver, the three of them focused entirely on the welfare of the animal before them. For 20 minutes, they coaxed and cared for Daisy, Alexander issuing calm, authoritative instructions that were immediately followed. Finally, with Alexander on one side and the driver on the other, they encouraged Daisy to try standing again. The horse struggled, her legs trembling with effort, but this time she managed to rise and stay up, though she swayed slightly on her feet. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the onlookers. Oliver's face broke into a wide, gap-toothed smile that struck Alexander with unexpected force. When was the last time he'd caused someone to smile like that? When was the last time he'd done something that generated genuine approval rather than fearful compliance. "She needs proper care," Alexander said to the driver, straightening up and brushing off his hands. "Rest, good feed, and a veterinary check." The driver's face fell. "I wish I could afford all that, sir, but with my wife's treatments—" "What's your name?" Alexander interrupted. "Thomas Baker, sir." Alexander reached into his pocket and extracted a business card and a pen. He wrote something on the back of the card before handing it to the surprised driver. "Take her to this address," he said, indicating what he'd written. "It's a private stable on the outskirts of the city. Tell them Alexander Harrington sent you, and they'll provide proper care for—" He paused, glancing at the horse. "For Daisy. I'll cover the expenses." Thomas stared at the card in disbelief. "Sir, I can't possibly—" "You can and you will," Alexander said firmly, falling back into his commanding tone. "Consider it an investment in Daisy's future productivity." Oliver looked up at Alexander with wide eyes. "You're really going to help her?" Alexander met the boy's gaze, finding himself strangely unable to dismiss the child as he would have done just an hour earlier. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." "Why?" Oliver asked with the direct curiosity only children can muster. The question caught Alexander off guard. He could have given any number of practical answers about efficiency, about the public relations aspect, about the minimal cost to him. Instead, he found himself saying something entirely unexpected. "Because you were right, and I was wrong." The admission, something he couldn't remember making in years, perhaps decades, felt foreign on his tongue. Yet somehow, standing there on the rain-dampened cobblestones beside a recovering horse, a grateful cart driver, and a small boy with uncommon courage, it felt like the only appropriate response. "Mr. Harrington," his assistant said tentatively, holding out his jacket and checking her watch with obvious anxiety. Alexander nodded, suddenly remembering the world that awaited his return: board meetings and investment decisions, power lunches, and strategic acquisitions. He took his jacket but didn't immediately put it on. "What school do you attend, Oliver?" he asked instead. "St. Martin's Primary, sir," the boy answered, still stroking Daisy's neck. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Good day, Oliver Mills. Perhaps our paths will cross again." As Alexander walked away, slipping his arms back into his jacket, he could feel the weight of Oliver's gaze following him. He didn't look back, striding with purpose toward his waiting car. But something had shifted inside him, a small, almost imperceptible change, like a hairline crack in a foundation that had once seemed impenetrable. "The Wellington meeting starts in 10 minutes, his assistant said, hurrying alongside him. "I've texted ahead to let them know we're on our way. The board is already assembled in the conference room." Alexander nodded absently, his mind still replaying the scene with the boy and the horse. The defiance in Oliver's eyes, the trembling determination in his small voice, it had awakened something dormant within him, something he'd buried beneath years of ruthless ambition and calculated indifference. "Sir?" His assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "Should I prepare a statement about what just happened? Several people were recording and it might appear on social media." "No," Alexander replied, his voice crisp and decisive once more. "Let it be. If anyone asks, simply say I was assisting with a transportation issue, nothing more." As he settled into the plush leather seat of his Bentley, Alexander found himself looking out the window at the now cleared intersection. Thomas Baker was leading Daisy slowly down a side street with Oliver still at the horse's side, one small hand resting reassuringly on her flank. The image lingered in Alexander's mind as the car pulled away, merging into London's relentless traffic. The remainder of the day proceeded as it always did, a carefully orchestrated sequence of meetings, calls, and decisions that kept Harrington Investments at the forefront of the financial world. Alexander moved through it all with his characteristic precision and authority, betraying nothing of the morning's unusual encounter. Yet as evening approached and he sat alone in his corner office, watching the city lights flicker to life below, Alexander found his thoughts returning to Oliver Mills. There had been something in the boy's stance, something in his unwavering protection of a creature he likely had no connection to, that refused to be dismissed from Alexander's mind. On impulse, he pressed the intercom button. "Margaret, get me everything you can find on St. Martin's Primary School. Student programs, financial status, recent achievements, everything." "Right away, Mr. Harrington," his secretary replied, her voice betraying no surprise at the unusual request. An hour later, as Alexander reviewed the information Margaret had compiled, a clear picture emerged. St. Martin's was a modest school in one of London's working-class neighborhoods, perpetually underfunded but achieving remarkable results due to dedicated teachers and an ethos of community support. The school building itself was in dire need of repairs, with a leaking roof and outdated facilities, yet its students consistently outperformed those from better-resourced institutions. Among the documents was a recent newspaper clipping featuring a small article about St. Martin's upcoming closure due to budget cuts. The photograph accompanying the piece showed a group of students and parents protesting outside the school gates, holding hand-painted signs. In the front row, barely visible but unmistakable to Alexander's newly attuned eye, stood Oliver Mills, his face set in that same determined expression that had confronted Alexander just hours earlier. Alexander sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For decades, he had operated according to a simple principle: investments must yield returns. Sentiment was a luxury for those who could afford failure. His father's voice echoed in his mind. The world respects only strength and decisiveness. Yet he couldn't deny the uncomfortable truth that had been growing within him since that morning. The boy's courage had commanded more genuine respect than Alexander's wealth and power ever had. The spontaneous cheer from the crowd when Daisy had risen to her feet had contained more real appreciation than any boardroom applause he'd ever received. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on his desk, his son James, at his boarding school graduation. The boy's smile was polite but distant, his eyes carrying a reserve that mirrored Alexander's own. When was the last time they'd had a real conversation? When was the last time James had looked at him with anything other than dutiful respect? The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Sir, your car is waiting to take you to the charity gala." "Cancel it," Alexander said after a moment's hesitation. "Send my regrets and a donation twice the amount of last year's. I have other matters to attend to this evening." There was a brief pause. "Yes, Mr. Harrington. Anything else?" "Have my driver take me to the Harrington stables instead." 30 minutes later, Alexander stood in the immaculate aisle of his private stables, a facility he maintained more out of habit and status than any recent passion for equestrianism. The stable manager, a competent woman named Claire who had been running the operation for years, looked surprised to see him. "Mr. Harrington, we weren't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "Perfectly fine, Claire," he replied, glancing around at the gleaming stalls and expensive equipment. "I sent a horse here earlier today, a cart horse named Daisy. Has she arrived?" "Yes, sir, about an hour ago. A rather thin chestnut mare with a white blaze. We've put her in the rehabilitation stall at the end. The vet has already examined her." Alexander nodded, already walking toward the indicated stall. "And the prognosis?" "Exhaustion, malnutrition, and some minor abrasions, but nothing that proper care won't fix," Claire reported, falling into step beside him. "She's quite a gentle soul, actually. Grateful for the attention." They reached Daisy's stall, and Alexander found himself looking at a different animal than the one he'd encountered that morning. Already, with just a few hours of care, proper water, and quality feed, the mare's eyes were brighter, her posture more relaxed. She turned her head toward him, ears pricking forward with interest. "Hello, Daisy," Alexander said quietly, extending his hand. The horse sniffed his fingers cautiously before allowing him to stroke her nose. "You're looking better already." Claire watched with barely concealed surprise. In the 5 years she'd managed the stables, she'd never seen Alexander Harrington interact personally with any of the horses. He owned them, funded their care, and occasionally used the facility for business entertainment, but he'd shown little interest in the animals themselves. "She's a survivor," Claire offered, strong spirit beneath the exhaustion. Alexander nodded, continuing to stroke Daisy's nose. "She reminded me of something today," he said, almost to himself. Then more directly to Claire, "I want her to receive the best possible care, whatever she needs. And when she's recovered, find her meaningful work here. Something that respects her dignity but doesn't overtax her strength." "Of course, Mr. Harrington." Alexander turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. There's a cart driver named Thomas Baker. He's Daisy's owner. Keep him informed of her progress, and—" he hesitated, an unfamiliar uncertainty in his voice. "Arrange for him to visit her whenever he wishes." Claire's professional composure slipped for a moment. "Sir?" "You heard me," Alexander said, his tone reverting to its usual crispness. "And I'll need the address for St. Martin's Primary School. I have some business to attend to there tomorrow." As he walked back to his waiting car, Alexander felt that hairline crack within him widening just a fraction more. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was acting without a clear strategic objective, without a calculated return on investment. It was unsettling, yet there was something almost liberating in it too, like the first breath of air after emerging from deep water. "Home, sir?" his driver asked as Alexander settled into the back seat. Alexander checked his watch. It was barely past 8. "No," he said after a moment's thought. "Take me to Westfield Estate. I believe I have a school play to attend." The Westfield Estate Academy stood as a monument to privilege, its Gothic spires and manicured grounds bathed in soft spotlight illumination. As Alexander's car approached the ornate gates, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. It had been over 2 years since he'd last visited his son's school, delegating parent-teacher conferences to his executive assistant and sending his regrets for most school functions. Tonight's performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream was already underway when Alexander slipped quietly into the auditorium. The usher, recognizing him immediately despite his rare appearances, directed him to a reserved seat that remained perpetually empty at these events, a courtesy to the Harrington name and generous endowment. On stage, students in elaborate costumes moved through Shakespeare's fantastical world with varying degrees of teenage awkwardness and surprising grace. Alexander scanned the performance looking for James. When he finally spotted his son in the role of Puck, he was momentarily taken aback. Gone was the serious, reserved boy from the graduation photo. In his place stood a young man who, freed by the mischievous character, seemed alive with energy and genuine joy. James moved across the stage with a lightness Alexander had never witnessed in him before, delivering his lines with a confidence and humor that drew appreciative laughter from the audience. Alexander found himself leaning forward, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watched his son transform on stage. "He's quite talented, isn't he?" whispered a voice beside him. Alexander turned to find a woman he vaguely recognized as one of the English teachers watching him with a knowing expression. "Yes," Alexander replied, surprised by the pride that swelled in his chest. "Yes, he is." "He's worked incredibly hard on this performance," she continued, "rehearsing for months, even when he thought no one from home would see it." The simple statement struck Alexander like a physical blow. Had James truly expected to perform to an empty seat? Had Alexander's absence become so predictable that his son no longer even hoped for his presence? As the play continued, Alexander remained transfixed, seeing his son, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time in years. The realization was both wonderful and terrible. James was brilliant, charismatic, and passionate on stage. How much of his son's life had Alexander missed while building and maintaining his empire? When the final bows came, Alexander joined the audience in enthusiastic applause, standing with the rest of the proud parents. As the cast dispersed, he made his way backstage, navigating through excited family members and friends, congratulating the young performers. He found James removing his costume's leafy headdress, laughing with several other cast members. His son's back was to him, and for a moment, Alexander hesitated, suddenly uncertain of his welcome. "James," he finally said, his voice softer than its usual commanding tone. His son turned, the smile freezing on his face as shock replaced it. "Father, what are you doing here?" The question wasn't accusatory, merely bewildered, which somehow hurt more than anger would have. Alexander stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I came to see you perform," he said simply. "You were exceptional." James stared at him, clearly struggling to process his father's unexpected appearance. "But your assistant said you couldn't make it. Something about a charity gala." "I changed my mind," Alexander replied. Then, after a pause, "I'm sorry I've missed so many of these." The surrounding students fell quiet, sensing the weight of the moment between father and son. James continued to stare at Alexander, his expression a complex mixture of confusion, hope, and lingering hurt. "You've never seen me in a play before," he said finally, the statement hanging in the air between them. Alexander nodded, accepting the truth of it. "I know, that was my mistake." Something flickered in James's eyes, a guarded optimism tempered by years of disappointment. "Well, thank you for coming tonight." An awkward silence fell between them, years of distance creating a chasm too wide to bridge in a single conversation. Alexander cleared his throat. Would you like to get something to eat after you've changed?" James hesitated, glancing at his friends, who were making valiant efforts to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "Actually, we were all planning to go to that pizza place near the Commons to celebrate." "I see," Alexander said, trying to mask his disappointment. "Of course. Another time then." "You could join us," James offered unexpectedly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did Alexander. "I mean, if you want to. It's nothing fancy, just pizza and probably too much soda." Alexander blinked, momentarily at a loss. When was the last time he'd eaten pizza? Probably not since James was in primary school, during those rare weekends when Alexander had managed to carve out a few hours for his son between business trips. "I'd like that," he found himself saying, "if you're sure your friends wouldn't mind." And so it was that Alexander Harrington, whose dining experiences typically involved Michelin stars and private rooms, found himself seated at a crowded pizza parlor, surrounded by exuberant teenagers, still riding the high of their successful performance. The plastic booth was cramped, the table slightly sticky, and the ambient noise level would have given his usual dining companions heart palpitations. Yet as he watched James interact with his friends, relaxed, animated, and occasionally shooting disbelieving glances at his father, Alexander felt strangely content. He said little, mostly observing, occasionally answering questions directed his way by the braver members of the group. "So, Mr. Harrington, what did you think of the play?" asked a girl who had played Titania, her glittery makeup still sparkling around her eyes. "I thought it was remarkably well done," Alexander answered honestly. "The energy on stage was infectious," James looked at him with surprise. You've seen professional productions, though. This must have seemed pretty amateur in comparison. Alexander considered his words carefully. Professional doesn't always mean better, he said finally. What I saw tonight had something many professional productions lack: genuine heart. The table fell momentarily silent, and Alexander wondered if he'd said something wrong. Then James smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes in a way Alexander hadn't seen in years. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself relaxing incrementally, his tie loosened, his usual rigid posture softening. He listened as the teenagers discussed their performance, their classes, their hopes for university. He found himself laughing at their jokes, genuinely impressed by their insights, and increasingly aware of how much of James's world he had missed. When the gathering finally began to disperse, fathers and mothers arriving to collect their children, Alexander and James walked together to the waiting Bentley. Thanks for coming tonight, James said, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. It meant a lot. Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I'm the one who should be thankful for the invitation, for letting me see this part of your life. James looked up, studying his father's face as if searching for something. What's different? He asked suddenly. Something's changed with you. Alexander thought of Oliver Mills standing defiantly between him and Daisy, willing to take a blow meant for a suffering creature. He thought of the spontaneous kindness of strangers bringing water and sugar cubes, the cheer when the horse had risen to her feet. He thought of the unexpected lightness he'd felt watching his son perform, laughing with his friends. I think, Alexander said slowly, I'm beginning to see things I've been blind to for a very long time. The following morning, Alexander woke before his alarm. Despite the late night with James, he felt oddly refreshed, as if some long-carried weight had been partially lifted from his shoulders. As he sipped his coffee and reviewed the morning news on his tablet, he found himself distracted, his mind wandering to the day ahead, to St. Martin's Primary School, to Oliver Mills. His driver navigated through London's morning traffic, eventually turning into a neighborhood that grew progressively more modest with each street. When they finally pulled up in front of St. Martin's, Alexander was struck by the stark contrast to Westfield Academy. Where his son's school boasted manicured grounds and Gothic architecture, St. Martin's was a plain brick building with cracked concrete steps and a small, worn playground enclosed by a chain-link fence. Children in simple uniforms streamed through the gates, their excited chatter filling the morning air. A few parents glanced curiously at the gleaming Bentley that seemed so out of place in their neighborhood, but most were too busy with the morning rush to pay it much attention. Alexander straightened his tie and stepped out of the car. Wait here, he instructed his driver. I'm not sure how long this will take. The school's entrance hall was bright but shabby, scuffed floors, bulletin boards crowded with children's artwork, and walls that desperately needed repainting. A middle-aged woman at the reception desk looked up as Alexander approached, her eyes widening slightly at his impeccable suit and commanding presence. Good morning, Alexander said, his usual brisk tone softened slightly. I'd like to speak with your headmaster, please. My name is Alexander Harrington. The woman's eyes widened further. Mr. Harrington? The Mr. Harrington? Alexander nodded, accustomed to this reaction. Is the headmaster available? Yes, of course, she stammered, reaching for the phone. Mr. Phillips will be delighted to meet you. Please, have a seat while I let him know you're here. Alexander remained standing, taking in his surroundings. The school's modest resources were evident everywhere, yet there was something warm about the space. Children's voices echoed from nearby classrooms, punctuated by occasional laughter. The artwork on the walls, though created with inexpensive materials, showed imagination and care. A small plaque near the office caught his eye. St. Martin's Primary School, where every child matters. The simplicity of the statement struck him unexpectedly. Mr. Harrington, what an unexpected pleasure. Alexander turned to find a thin, energetic man with wire-rimmed glasses approaching, hand outstretched. His suit was well worn but immaculately pressed, his smile genuine if somewhat bewildered. I'm Edward Phillips, headmaster. This is quite a surprise. What brings Harrington Investments to our humble school? Alexander shook the offered hand. A student of yours, actually, Oliver Mills. The headmaster's expression shifted to one of concern. Oliver? Has something happened? Nothing to worry about, Alexander assured him. I met young Oliver yesterday in rather unusual circumstances. He made quite an impression. Mr. Phillips relaxed, a fond smile replacing his worry. Ah, that sounds like our Oliver. Remarkable boy. Heart twice the size of most adults I know. He checked his watch. Year 4 should be in mathematics now with Ms. Donovan. Would you care to observe? I admit I'm curious about what brought you here. Alexander nodded, and the headmaster led him through narrow corridors where children occasionally peered out of classrooms at the unusual visitor. They stopped outside a classroom door with colorful number charts decorating the windows. Through the glass panel, Alexander could see about 20 children bent over their desks, pencils in hand. At the front, a young teacher was enthusiastically explaining a concept, using exaggerated gestures that had several students giggling. And there, in the third row, sat Oliver Mills, the same determined chin, the same earnest expression as he concentrated on his work. I'd like to speak with Oliver privately, if that's possible, Alexander said. The headmaster hesitated. We generally don't interrupt lessons, and we'd need parental permission for a student to meet with a visitor. Of course, Alexander conceded. Perhaps during their break time, and you're welcome to be present. This seemed to reassure Mr. Phillips, who nodded. They'll have recess in 30 minutes. In the meantime, would you like a tour of our facilities? Though I warn you, we're not exactly Westfield Academy. Alexander raised an eyebrow. You know where my son attends school? The headmaster smiled sheepishly. Everyone in education knows the Harrington name, sir. Your endowments to private academies are legendary, as are your business achievements, of course. As they walked the halls of St. Martin's, Alexander saw both the challenges and the triumphs of the school. The library was small but cozy, with children sprawled on worn cushions, absorbed in their books. The computer lab featured outdated equipment that Mr. Phillips apologetically explained they maintained through creative IT solutions. The gym doubled as the cafeteria and assembly hall, requiring daily transformations by the maintenance staff. Yet throughout the tour, what struck Alexander most was the atmosphere. Despite the limited resources, there was an unmistakable energy to the place, a sense of purpose and community that reminded him, oddly enough, of the crowd that had gathered around Daisy the day before. Our greatest asset is our people, Mr. Phillips was saying as they passed a classroom where a gray-haired teacher was reading expressively to captivated students. Teachers who could earn more elsewhere but choose to stay, parents who volunteer countless hours, community members who donate what they can. And the closure? Alexander asked, remembering the newspaper article. Is it definite? The headmaster's enthusiasm dimmed. Unless a miracle occurs, yes. The building's been purchased by a development company. We have until the end of the academic year to find alternative arrangements, but suitable properties in the area are either non-existent or far beyond our budget. Before Alexander could respond, a bell rang, and suddenly the hallways flooded with children rushing toward the playground. Mr. Phillips led Alexander to a small conference room with a window overlooking the play area. I'll fetch Oliver, the headmaster said, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. Through the window, Alexander watched the children at play. Their uniforms might be second-hand, their playground equipment dated, but their joy was boundless. He spotted Oliver, smaller than many of his peers, organizing what appeared to be a complex game involving chalk lines and elaborate rules. "Mr. Harrington?" Alexander turned to find Oliver standing in the doorway, eyes wide with surprise, the headmaster just behind him. "Hello, Oliver," Alexander said, suddenly feeling strangely nervous. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." Oliver entered cautiously, glancing at Mr. Phillips for reassurance. "Is Daisy okay?" he asked immediately, concern evident in his voice. The question touched Alexander unexpectedly. This child's first thought was not about why a powerful stranger had sought him out, but about the welfare of a horse he had defended. "Daisy is doing very well," Alexander assured him. "She's receiving excellent care at my stables. In fact, the veterinarian believes she'll make a complete recovery." Relief washed over Oliver's face, his shoulders relaxing visibly. "That's good. She was trying really hard, you know. She just needed someone to give her a chance." Alexander studied the boy who had stood between him and a helpless animal, who had risked himself for a creature others had deemed worthless. In that moment, he recognized what had drawn him back to Oliver Mills. The boy possessed a clarity of purpose and a moral certainty that Alexander himself had long ago sacrificed at the altar of success. "Tell me about yourself, Oliver," Alexander said, sitting down across from the boy. "What subjects do you enjoy at school?" Oliver seemed to consider the question seriously. "I like science best, and stories, reading and writing them. Ms. Donovan says I have a good imagination." He hesitated, then added with the directness of childhood, "Why are you here, sir? Is it really just about Daisy?" Mr. Phillips made a small sound of disapproval at the blunt question, but Alexander found himself appreciating the boy's forthrightness. "Partly about Daisy," he admitted, "but mostly about you." Oliver's brow furrowed. "Me? But I didn't do anything special." "I disagree," Alexander said quietly. "What you did yesterday took considerable courage. Standing up to an adult, especially one in a position of power, isn't easy." Oliver shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what was right. Anyone would have." "But they didn't," Alexander pointed out. "Others saw what was happening. They watched. Only you stepped forward." The boy looked down at his hands, then back up at Alexander. "My mom says sometimes you have to stand up even when you're scared, especially for those who can't stand up for themselves." A shadow crossed his face. "She's really brave too. She works 2 jobs since Dad left, but she never complains." Alexander nodded, feeling a new weight to the conversation. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She is," Oliver agreed earnestly. "She's a nurse's aide during the day and cleans offices at night. She's always tired, but she still helps me with my homework and comes to all my school things. She'd be here now if she didn't have to work." The headmaster, who had been quietly observing, added softly, "Mrs. Mills is one of our most dedicated parents. Despite her schedule, she volunteers for every school event she can manage." Alexander absorbed this information, thinking of his own absences from James's life. This woman with so little free time made sure to be present for her son, while he, with all his resources, had repeatedly chosen boardroom meetings over school plays. "What happens to you when St. Martin's closes?" Alexander asked, deliberately shifting the subject. Oliver's eyes widened, his expression growing solemn. "I don't know. Mom says not to worry, but I heard her talking to our neighbor about maybe moving away from London where schools aren't so full." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "But that means she'd have to leave her hospital job, and she loves helping the patients." Mr. Phillips sighed. "Unfortunately, Oliver's situation isn't unique. Many of our families will face difficult decisions when we close. The nearest schools with openings are either too far for practical commuting or, well, they don't offer the same supportive environment we've built here. Alexander studied Oliver, seeing not just a brave boy who had stood up for a horse, but a child whose future hung in the balance due to circumstances entirely beyond his control. It reminded him of Daisy, giving everything she had until her body simply couldn't continue. The parallel was uncomfortably clear. "I'd like to visit your stables sometime," Oliver said suddenly, his eyes brightening. "To see Daisy, I mean, if that's allowed." The simple request, free of any guile or self-interest, struck Alexander deeply. Here was a child with every reason to be preoccupied with his own precarious situation, yet his concern remained focused on the welfare of others. "I think that could be arranged," Alexander replied. "Perhaps this weekend, if your mother approves, you could see how Daisy is progressing." Oliver beamed. "Really? That would be brilliant. I've never been to real stables before." The bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Mr. Phillips checked his watch. "I'm afraid Oliver needs to return to class now." Oliver stood, hesitating for a moment before extending his hand to Alexander with endearing formality. "Thank you for helping Daisy, Mr. Harrington, and for coming to see me." Alexander shook the small hand, struck by the earnestness in the gesture. "Thank you, Oliver, for the reminder about doing what's right." As Oliver left for his class, Alexander remained seated, lost in thought. Mr. Phillips watched him curiously. "He's quite something, isn't he?" the headmaster said with evident pride. "Yes," Alexander agreed. "He is." After a moment he added, "I'd like to know more about the situation with the school closure, if you don't mind." For the next hour, Alexander listened as Mr. Phillips outlined the school's predicament. The building had been sold to Westbrook Development Group, a mid-sized property developer planning to convert the site into luxury flats. The local council had tried to intervene but ultimately lacked the funds to purchase the property themselves. The school's operating license would expire at the end of the academic year, leaving just 4 months to find a solution. "We've explored every avenue," Mr. Phillips concluded, pushing his glasses up his nose with a weary gesture. "Alternative locations, merging with other schools, even private funding campaigns. Nothing has panned out." Alexander's mind was already working, analyzing the problem as he would a business challenge. "This Westbrook development, they finalized the purchase?" "Yes, contracts were signed last month. Construction is set to begin in July." "And the asking price?" Mr. Phillips named a figure that made him wince but would be a relatively minor investment for Harrington Holdings. "Far beyond what we could raise, even with our most optimistic fundraising projections." Alexander stood, straightening his suit jacket with a decisive movement. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Phillips, and for the tour of your school. It's been illuminating." The headmaster rose as well, clearly puzzled by the abrupt conclusion. "Of course. May I ask what your interest is in our situation?" Alexander considered the question. 24 hours ago, he would have had no interest whatsoever in the fate of a struggling primary school in a working-class neighborhood. School closures and property developments were simply the natural progression of market forces. Regrettable, perhaps, but ultimately necessary for economic growth. Now, however, he saw more than market forces at work. He saw Oliver Mills and dozens of children like him. He saw dedicated teachers and parents fighting against impossible odds. He saw a community worth preserving. "Let's just say I'm exploring some possibilities," Alexander replied. "I'll be in touch." As his driver navigated back toward the financial district, Alexander made a series of calls. First to his personal assistant, instructing her to cancel his meetings for the remainder of the day. Then to his legal team, requesting immediate research on Westbrook Development Group. Finally to Margaret, his secretary. Margaret, I need everything you can find on property development regulations in this particular London borough, and contact Jeffries in our real estate division. I want a complete analysis of the St. Martin's School property and surrounding area on my desk by tomorrow morning." Through the car window, Alexander watched as London transformed around him, modest neighborhoods giving way to increasingly affluent districts, finally culminating in the gleaming glass towers of the financial center. Yet in his mind, he remained in that small conference room at St. Martin's, seeing the hope in Oliver's eyes when he spoke of visiting Daisy. By late afternoon, Alexander had established himself in a rarely used conference room at Harrington Tower, the walls now covered with maps, property documents, and financial projections. His jacket was discarded over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his tie loosened, a disheveled state his colleagues would have found shocking. Richard Westbrook, of Westbrook Development Group, had readily agreed to a meeting when Alexander's office had called. Few in London's business community would decline a request from Alexander Harrington. Now the developer sat across from Alexander, a mixture of curiosity and wariness on his face. "I appreciate you meeting on such short notice, Westbrook," Alexander said, studying the man before him. Richard Westbrook was in his early 50s, successful but not in Alexander's league, the type of businessman who had done well but would never break into the highest echelons of finance. "Of course, Mr. Harrington, though I confess I'm puzzled by your interest in our modest St. Martin's development." Alexander pushed a document across the table. "I want to buy you out. The price listed there includes a 20% premium on your investment to compensate for any inconvenience." Westbrook glanced at the figure and blinked rapidly, clearly shocked. "This is unexpected. The St. Martin's project is set to be quite profitable. We've already pre-sold 30% of the units." "I'm aware," Alexander replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "You'll find the compensation for breaking those contracts is included in my offer, along with an additional buffer for your company's projected profit margin." "May I ask why?" Westbrook asked, unable to mask his curiosity. "This site has no strategic value for Harrington Holdings. It's not even in a district where you typically operate." Alexander considered how much to reveal. "Let's just say I'm diversifying into educational investments." Westbrook's eyes narrowed slightly. "The school? You want to save that old place?" He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "I never figured you for a sentimentalist, Harrington." "I'm not," Alexander replied coolly. "I'm a businessman making a business decision. The question is whether you're prepared to accept my offer or if I need to pursue more aggressive options." The implied threat hung in the air. Both men knew that if Alexander Harrington decided to target Westbrook Development, he had the resources to make life very difficult for the smaller company, from outbidding them on future projects to influencing lenders to tighten their credit terms. Westbrook studied the offer again, clearly calculating. "This is generous," he admitted finally, "but I'd need assurances that my investors won't be left in an awkward position." "Naturally," Alexander said, sliding another folder across the table. "My legal team has drafted a complete transition plan. Your investors will be fully protected, and your company's reputation enhanced by the positive PR of facilitating an educational initiative." They spent the next hour negotiating details, but the outcome was never really in doubt. By the time Westbrook left, they had a handshake agreement, with formal contracts to follow within 48 hours. Alexander remained at the conference table, staring at the school building plans spread before him. What he'd told Westbrook wasn't entirely a lie. This was a business decision, but one driven by a new set of metrics that Alexander himself was still struggling to define. His phone buzzed with a message from Claire at the stables. "Thomas Baker is here to see Daisy. Thought you might want to know." Alexander checked his watch. There was still time before his dinner meeting with James. "Tell him I'll be there in 30 minutes," he replied. When Alexander arrived at Harrington's stables, he found Thomas Baker standing outside Daisy's stall, his weathered face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions as he watched the horse contentedly munching fresh hay. "Mr. Baker," Alexander said, approaching the man, "I trust you're satisfied with Daisy's care?" Thomas turned, clearly startled by Alexander's appearance. He removed his cap hastily. "Mr. Harrington, sir, I didn't expect, that is, I was just—" He took a breath. "Yes, sir. The care is beyond anything I could have provided. She looks like a different animal already." Alexander nodded, studying the horse. Daisy did indeed look remarkably improved. Her coat was beginning to regain its luster, and though still thin, her eyes were bright and alert. "The veterinarian believes she'll be fully recovered within a few weeks," Alexander said. "She's quite resilient." Thomas nodded, twisting his cap in his hands. "That she is, sir. Always been a fighter, Daisy has." He hesitated, then added, "About your offer to cover the costs. It's more than generous, but I can't accept charity. I'd like to work out some way to repay you, even if it takes years." Alexander studied the man, proud despite his circumstances, unwilling to accept what he perceived as handouts. In that moment, Alexander recognized something of himself in Thomas Baker, a shared stubbornness that both men would likely call principle. "It's not charity," Alexander said firmly. "It's an investment. Daisy is a valuable animal with years of service ahead of her. Speaking of which, I understand you've been having difficulties with your business due to your wife's medical situation." Thomas's shoulders stiffened slightly. "We're managing, sir." "I'm sure you are. Nevertheless, I have a proposition for you." Alexander gestured toward a bench near the stable's entrance. "Shall we sit?" As they settled on the bench, Alexander outlined his idea. Harrington Holdings had numerous properties across London, requiring regular deliveries and transportation services. Would Baker be interested in contracting his cart services exclusively to Harrington, with a new, healthier horse provided as part of the arrangement? Thomas listened with growing disbelief. "Sir, that's very kind, but my old cart is hardly suitable for a company like yours." "We would provide an appropriate vehicle, of course," Alexander said smoothly. "Consider it a business necessity. The contract would include healthcare benefits that would cover your wife's treatments." Thomas's eyes widened. "Mr. Harrington, why would you do this? You don't know me. Yesterday I was just a struggling carter holding up traffic." Alexander was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Let's say I recognize value where others might not see it. Loyalty, determination, resilience. These qualities matter in business partners." He paused. "And perhaps I owe you compensation for nearly striking your horse." The carter studied Alexander's face, clearly searching for the catch. Finding none, he slowly extended his hand. "I don't know what changed your mind about Daisy and about me, but I'm grateful for it, sir. I won't let you down." As they shook hands, Alexander felt an unfamiliar satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit margins or strategic advantages. "There's one more thing," Alexander said. "A boy named Oliver Mills and his mother will be visiting Daisy this weekend. I'd like you to be here. I think Oliver would appreciate meeting Daisy's owner." Thomas nodded, a small smile appearing. "The boy who stood up to you? Claire told me about him, brave little chap." "Yes," Alexander agreed quietly. "Braver than most grown men I know." After Thomas left, Alexander lingered at the stables, watching Daisy as she rested peacefully in her stall. There was something calming about the animal's presence, a simplicity and honesty that had become rare in his world of complex financial maneuvers and strategic deceptions. His phone rang, James calling to confirm their dinner plans. As Alexander spoke with his son, making arrangements to meet at a restaurant James had selected. Not too fancy, Dad, okay? He found himself genuinely looking forward to the evening. 24 hours ago, such a dinner would have felt like an obligation to be managed. Now it felt like an opportunity to be treasured. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, a rarity for London in early spring. Alexander arrived at the stables early, having slept better than he had in months. The dinner with James had gone remarkably well. They'd really talked, about James's interest, his hopes for university, and even tentatively approached the subject of their strained relationship. There had been awkward moments, certainly, but also laughter and a genuine connection that Alexander hadn't realized how desperately he'd missed. Now, as he walked through the stable yard, Alexander found himself oddly nervous about Oliver's visit. He had orchestrated multi-billion-dollar mergers with less anxiety than he felt about impressing an 8-year-old boy and his mother. Claire approached, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. This is becoming quite the habit," she remarked with a hint of gentle teasing. 3 visits in 3 days. I believe that's a record." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the observation. "How is Daisy this morning?" "Improving steadily. The vet is very pleased with her progress." Claire hesitated, then added, "May I ask what's happening with the school? There are rumors circulating that Harrington Holdings has purchased the St. Martin's property." "News travels fast," Alexander said dryly. "Thomas mentioned you'd been asking about the school when he visited yesterday," Claire explained, "and my sister's child attends St. Martin's. The parents are buzzing with speculation." Alexander sighed. He'd hoped to have everything finalized before making an announcement, but London's rumor mill was as efficient as ever. "Yes, we've acquired the property. The contracts were signed last night, but I'd appreciate discretion until we make an official statement next week." Claire nodded, clearly burning with unasked questions, but her professionalism prevailed. "Of course, sir. Oh, I believe your guests have arrived." Alexander turned to see a modest car pulling into the visitor parking area. Oliver jumped out almost before the vehicle had stopped, his face alight with excitement. A slender woman with Oliver's same determined chin emerged more slowly from the driver's side, her expression a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Oliver spotted Alexander and waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Harrington, we found it. Is Daisy here? Can we see her?" The woman placed a gentle restraining hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Oliver, remember what we discussed about manners," she said quietly, before extending her hand to Alexander. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Sarah Mills. Thank you for inviting us. Oliver has talked about nothing else for days." Alexander shook her hand, struck by the quiet dignity in her bearing. Despite what must have been an exhausting work schedule, Sarah Mills was immaculately groomed, her clothes modest but carefully maintained. Her eyes, the same clear blue as her son's, regarded Alexander with a directness that reminded him of Oliver's unflinching gaze. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Mills," Alexander replied. "Oliver made quite an impression on me." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Yes, the headmaster told me about your visit to the school. And please, it's Ms. Mills." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the correction. "Oliver, Daisy is indeed here, and she's been looking forward to your visit. Would you like to see her now?" "Yes, please," Oliver exclaimed, practically bouncing with anticipation. As they walked toward Daisy's stall, Alexander found himself explaining the stable operations to Oliver, who absorbed every detail with rapt attention. Sarah followed a few steps behind, her gaze taking in the immaculate facility with quiet assessment. When they reached Daisy's stall, the transformation in the horse was even more evident than it had been 2 days ago. Her coat gleamed in the morning light, and she held her head higher, the exhausted droop replaced by alert interest as they approached. "Daisy!" Oliver exclaimed, rushing to the stall door. The horse nickered softly in response, extending her head toward the boy as if in recognition. "She remembers me," Oliver said, wonder filling his voice. "Horses have excellent memories," came a voice from behind them. Thomas Baker approached, hat in hand, his weathered face breaking into a smile at Oliver's enthusiasm, especially for those who've been kind to them. Alexander made the introductions, watching as Oliver's eyes widened when he realized this was Daisy's owner. "Thank you for letting Mr. Harrington help Daisy," Oliver said earnestly to Thomas. "She looks so much happier now." "It's me who should be thanking you, young man," Thomas replied, genuine emotion in his voice. "If you hadn't stood up for her that day, things might have turned out very differently." While Oliver and Thomas talked about Daisy, Alexander found himself standing beside Sarah, who was watching her son with quiet pride. "He's always been like this," she said softly. "Ever since he was tiny. Can't bear to see anything suffering." "It's an admirable quality," Alexander replied, "and a rare one." Sarah turned to face him directly. "Mr. Harrington, while I appreciate your invitation today, I have to ask, what's your interest in my son? First the school visit, now this. It's a bit unusual, wouldn't you say?" The directness of the question caught Alexander off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. This was, after all, Oliver's mother. "Your son showed me something I'd forgotten," Alexander said after a moment's consideration. "The courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it might cost you." He paused. "That's a lesson worth remembering." Sarah studied him, her expression softening slightly. "Oliver said you were going to hit the horse, but then you helped her instead, that you admitted you were wrong." Alexander nodded, feeling strangely vulnerable under her frank assessment. "Yes, thanks to Oliver." "That couldn't have been easy for someone in your position," she observed. "No," Alexander agreed, "but it was necessary." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but thoughtful, as they watched Oliver carefully offering Daisy a carrot under Thomas's guidance. "Is it true what they're saying?" Sarah asked suddenly. "About Harrington Holdings buying the school property?" Alexander met her gaze. "Yes, the contracts were signed yesterday." Her eyes widened. "But why? I mean, I understand it's prime development land, but—" "It's not for development," Alexander interrupted gently. "The school will remain a school. In fact, if the Board of Governors agrees, we'll be funding a complete renovation and expansion." Sarah stared at him, clearly struggling to process this information. "You're saving St. Martin's? Because of Oliver?" "Your son showed me something valuable," Alexander said simply. "I'm merely acknowledging that value." Before Sarah could respond, Oliver called excitedly, "Mom, Mr. Baker says I can help groom Daisy. Can I?" Sarah glanced at Alexander, a new warmth in her eyes before turning to her son. "Of course, darling. Just follow Mr. Baker's instructions carefully." As Oliver was fitted with a small grooming brush, his face a picture of solemn responsibility, Alexander found himself watching not just the boy, but his mother. There was something in her quiet strength, her unwavering support of her son despite what must be crushing pressures, that commanded his respect. "Ms. Mills," he said, "while Oliver is occupied, perhaps we could discuss another matter. I understand you work 2 jobs currently." Sarah's guard immediately returned. "We manage just fine, Mr. Harrington." "I'm sure you do," Alexander replied. "But I have a proposition that might interest you, one that would allow you more time with Oliver while still utilizing your skills." Sarah's expression remained guarded, but curiosity flickered in her eyes. "What sort of proposition?" Alexander gestured toward a bench near the stable entrance, similar to where he'd sat with Thomas Baker the day before. "Perhaps we could sit for a moment." They settled on the bench, Sarah perched at the edge as if ready to rise at any moment. From their position, they could still see Oliver diligently brushing Daisy's flank under Thomas's gentle guidance, his face a study in concentration. "I've been reviewing the St. Martin's situation," Alexander began, choosing his words carefully. "The school needs more than just building renovations. It needs a community health program, something to address the physical and emotional well-being of the students and their families." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly. "That's an unusual focus for a businessman." "Perhaps," Alexander acknowledged. "But it's a practical one. Children learn better when they're healthy and their families are stable. It's an investment in the school's continued success." "And how does this relate to me?" Sarah asked, her wariness not entirely gone but tempered now with genuine interest. "You're a nurse's aide with years of experience working with patients. You understand healthcare from the ground up, not from an administrative distance. The program would need someone like you to coordinate it, someone who understands both medical needs and the specific challenges facing the St. Martin's community." Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Harrington?" "I'm proposing creating a position that would utilize your skills, provide a salary comparable to your current combined income, include full benefits, and operate during school hours so you could be home with Oliver in the evenings," Alexander said, his tone matter-of-fact. The Harrington Foundation would fund it initially, with the goal of securing additional grants to expand services over time. Sarah's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of naked hope before her natural caution reasserted itself. "This is unexpected, and frankly, a bit difficult to believe. Yesterday I didn't even know you, and today you're offering to transform my family's life." Alexander understood her skepticism. In her position, he would have been looking for the hidden agenda, the strings attached to what seemed too good to be true. "I understand your hesitation," he said, "and I'm not asking for an answer today. Think about it. Discuss it with Oliver. I can have a formal proposal sent to you next week with all the details." Sarah studied him, her blue eyes, so like her son's, searching his face. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Harrington? The school, this job offer. It's not just because Oliver stood up to you over a horse." Alexander was silent for a moment, contemplating how to answer. Finally, he said, "When your son stepped between me and Daisy, he forced me to see something I'd been ignoring for a very long time. The world I've built for myself, a world measured solely by profit margins and strategic advantages, is ultimately hollow." He paused, watching Oliver laugh as Daisy nuzzled his pocket for another treat. "Oliver reminded me that courage isn't about power or wealth. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you something." Sarah's expression softened. "He has that effect on people. His teacher says he's the conscience of the classroom." "I believe it," Alexander said with a small smile. "In any case, my offer stands regardless of your decision. St. Martin's will be renovated, and Thomas Baker's contract with Harrington Holdings has already been signed. I've made many investments in my life, Ms. Mills, but few with as much potential return as these." Before Sarah could respond, Oliver came running over, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Mr. Baker says Daisy might be able to give riding lessons to kids someday when she's stronger. Could I learn to ride her?" Sarah smiled, ruffling her son's hair. "We'll see, darling. That would be up to Mr. Baker and Mr. Harrington." "I think it's an excellent idea," Alexander said. "Daisy has a gentle temperament. She'd make a fine teaching horse once she's fully recovered." Oliver beamed, then suddenly grew serious. "Mr. Harrington, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you change your mind about Daisy that day? You were going to hit her, but then you didn't." The directness of the question, so typical of Oliver, caught Alexander slightly off guard. He was aware of Sarah watching him closely, awaiting his answer as much as her son was. Because you showed me something important, Alexander said simply. You showed me that true strength isn't about dominance or control, it's about compassion, about recognizing when you're wrong and having the courage to change course. He paused. Not many people stand up to me, Oliver. I'm grateful that you did. Oliver considered this solemnly, then nodded as if satisfied. Daisy's grateful too, I can tell. As they prepared to leave, with promises of another visit soon, Alexander watched Sarah and Oliver walk back to their modest car, the boy chattering animatedly about everything he'd learned about horses. There was a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, perhaps not since James had been Oliver's age, before Alexander had allowed the demands of building his empire to erode the foundations of his family. They're good people, Thomas said, coming to stand beside Alexander. The boy's got a rare spirit. Yes, Alexander agreed, and his mother as well. Thomas nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. Life has a funny way of bringing us what we need, doesn't it? Not always what we think we want, but what we truly need. The observation coming from the cart driver, whose life had been as different from Alexander's as possible, struck home with surprising force. What had Alexander truly needed? Not more wealth or power, he had those in abundance. Perhaps what he'd needed was precisely this, a reminder of what truly mattered, the courage of a child, the dignity of a man who refused charity but accepted partnership, the strength of a woman who worked 2 jobs to give her son a better life, and a horse, a simple, suffering creature whose need had cracked open something long dormant in Alexander's heart. Later that evening, as Alexander sat in his study reviewing the week's events, his phone rang. It was James. Dad, is it still okay if I come home for Sunday lunch tomorrow? I know we didn't really confirm. Of course, Alexander said immediately, warmth flooding his voice. I was just about to call you. In fact, I was thinking, if you're free next weekend, there's someone I'd like you to meet. A remarkable young man named Oliver Mills. As he spoke with his son, making plans not just for tomorrow but for the weeks ahead, Alexander gazed at the framed photograph on his desk. James at his graduation, smiling politely but distantly. Soon, he thought, he would replace it with a new image. Perhaps one of James laughing at the pizza restaurant, or of the 2 of them together at the stables with Daisy and Oliver. A new beginning, prompted by a boy's courage and a horse's silent dignity. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast a golden glow over the renovated grounds of St. Martin's Primary School. Where once there had been cracked concrete and rusting chain-link fences, now stood modern play equipment, a small garden with raised beds tended by the students, and a newly constructed community health center attached to the main building. The school itself had been transformed, its aging infrastructure replaced, classrooms equipped with current technology, and the library expanded to 3 times its previous size. Alexander Harrington stood at the edge of the playground, watching as children rushed out for their morning break. His visits to St. Martin's had become a regular occurrence over the past year, initially to oversee the renovation project, but increasingly because he found genuine pleasure in seeing the school thrive. Quite a change from when you first visited, isn't it? Edward Phillips, still the headmaster but now with considerably fewer worry lines etched into his face, came to stand beside Alexander. Indeed, Alexander agreed, though I'd argue the most significant changes aren't visible in the bricks and mortar. Phillips nodded, understanding. The community health program has been transformative. Attendance is up almost 20% now that we can address health issues on site, and having parents involved in the school as volunteers has strengthened the entire community. Alexander spotted Sarah Mills emerging from the health center, clipboard in hand, deep in conversation with a young mother and her child. In her role as community health coordinator, Sarah had blossomed, bringing together local medical professionals, social services, and parent volunteers to create a support network that extended far beyond the school's walls. The position she had initially approached with such caution had become a calling, one that utilized not just her medical knowledge, but her natural ability to connect with people in difficult circumstances. "Mr. Harrington," Alexander turned to see Oliver racing toward him, now 9 years old and growing taller by the month, it seemed. The boy had lost none of his enthusiasm nor his moral certainty in the past year. If anything, his confidence had grown along with his responsibilities as one of the student leaders of the school's newly formed Animal Welfare Club. "Hello, Oliver," Alexander greeted him warmly. "How are the preparations for Saturday's event coming along?" "Brilliant," Oliver exclaimed. "We've made all the posters, and Mr. Baker is bringing Daisy and the new horse, Scout. James said he'd help us set up the riding demonstration area." The event Oliver referred to was the first annual St. Martin's Community Fair, designed to showcase the school's programs and raise additional funds for the student initiatives. What had begun as Alexander's personal project had evolved into a true community effort, with local businesses contributing and families volunteering their time. "Excellent," Alexander said. "And your mother mentioned you have some special news to share?" Oliver's face lit up with pride. "I won the Young Writers competition. My story about Daisy is going to be published in a real book." "Congratulations," Alexander said, genuinely pleased. "That's quite an achievement." "It's about the day we met," Oliver continued earnestly. "About how sometimes being brave means standing up even when you're scared, and how people can change when you give them a chance." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at the boy's words. "That's a story worth telling," he said softly. As Oliver raced back to join his friends, Alexander found himself reflecting on the cascading changes that had stemmed from that morning on a London street. His own life had transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. His relationship with James had been painstakingly rebuilt, with father and son now sharing not just obligatory family dinners, but genuine interests and honest conversations. Harrington Holdings continued to thrive, but with a newly established social responsibility division that evaluated investments not just for their financial return, but for their impact on communities and employees. The shift had initially been met with skepticism from the board, but the positive press and improved employee retention had quickly silenced the critics. More significant than any corporate change, however, was the shift in Alexander himself. The man who had once viewed the world exclusively through the lens of profit and loss now found himself considering the human element in every decision. The ruthless efficiency that had been his hallmark had not disappeared, but had been tempered by something new: compassion. After the school bell called the children back inside, Alexander made his way to his waiting car, where his driver stood holding the door. "To the office, sir?" "No," Alexander decided. "To the stables, please." Harrington Stables had undergone its own transformation. What had once been primarily a showplace for Alexander's seldom-used thoroughbreds now housed a therapeutic riding program, where children with disabilities and veterans with PTSD worked with specially trained horses. Daisy, fully recovered and sleek with health, had proven particularly adept at connecting with anxious children, her gentle patience making her a favorite among the program's participants. Alexander found Thomas Baker in the training ring, leading a young horse through basic commands. In the past year, Thomas had gone from struggling cart driver to respected stable manager, his natural affinity for horses and quiet competence earning him the position on merit rather than charity. "Mr. Harrington," Thomas greeted him with a smile. "Didn't expect to see you today. Come to check on the preparations for Saturday?" "Partly," Alexander admitted, watching as the young horse followed Thomas's gentle guidance. "But mostly I wanted to see how Scout is progressing." "He's coming along nicely," Thomas said, patting the horse's neck. Still a bit skittish after what he went through, but he's learning to trust again. Scout had been rescued from an abusive situation 3 months earlier, his condition reminiscent of Daisy's when Alexander had first encountered her. This time, however, Alexander hadn't hesitated to intervene, personally funding the horse's rehabilitation and creating a position for him in the therapeutic program. "The Mills boy has been a godsend with him," Thomas continued. "Something about Oliver seems to calm the most troubled animals. He's got a gift." Alexander nodded, remembering how Oliver had stood between him and Daisy that day, a small figure facing down a perceived threat with nothing but moral certainty as his shield. "Yes," he agreed, "he certainly does." Later, as Alexander walked through the stable yard, he paused at Daisy's stall. The mare approached immediately, extending her head for the apple she knew he often carried. As he stroked her gleaming neck, Alexander marveled at the unlikely catalyst she had been for so much change. A year ago, he had stood in an intersection, whip raised, representing everything he had been taught about power and control. A boy had intervened, offering a different vision of strength, one based on compassion rather than dominance, on moral courage rather than financial might. In challenging Alexander to be better, Oliver Mills had set in motion a transformation that extended far beyond one man, one horse, or one school. The ripples continued to spread outward, affecting lives in ways that could never have been calculated on any balance sheet. As Daisy nudged his pocket for another treat, Alexander smiled. Some investments, he had learned, yielded returns that could never be measured in pounds or dollars. Some wealth couldn't be counted or hoarded. And sometimes the greatest strength lay not in dominance but in the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the wisdom to change course when a child showed you a better way.